All right, this is the preview episode for the week of November 21, and we all know what's coming up November 21, and we have a huge day of boxing that'll be headlined at night, live on HBO pay-per-view, between Miguel Cotto and Canelo Alvarez. Before we get into that pay-per-view and all the fights that are coming down this weekend, we got to talk about Ronda Rousey. See, it's about now. Maybe it's already happened, but we're going to start hearing the excuses for why she lost, for why she was knocked out by former world champion boxer Holly Holm. And it'll be something like she wasn't prepared, or she had too much going on, or that Rousey was just distracted, or had too many distractions in camp. And those are all good excuses, and there might be some shred of validity or truth in them, but it's not the reason why Rousey lost. Because Rousey pretty much looked like she normally does. See, why she lost, and we see this in boxing a lot, is that there was a level of hubris that she had in that ring that Holly Holm took advantage of. Ronda Rousey bought into her own hype last night. She came in and she gave Holm no respect. She tried to beat Holm at Holm's own game. See, Holm was a world champion boxer, and Rousey figured she was going to go stand up and beat her toe to toe, and then in doing so would have accomplished boxing just by nature, by virtue of beating a former world title holder. Rousey showed that she couldn't rattle Holm. Holm had just as much experience as Rousey at the top level. When you think about it, she had had title fights. Now, obviously, she hadn't fought fights with the scope and magnitude that Rousey does. You know, Rousey does pay-per-view events. Holm doesn't do that. But at the same time, Holm knows that pressure of fighting for titles. And Rousey basically came in with nothing to prove. Or at least she believed that she had nothing to prove. She believed all of what people had said about her. And it's about now that people might start to curb their expectations. You know, people were saying that Rousey was on her way to being, you know, one of the top athletes in the world, in all of sports, winning athlete of the year and all this stuff. I think she beat out Floyd Mayweather for combat sports athlete of the year. Probably not true. I think that was earlier in this year. After Mayweather had beaten Manny Pacquiao, we gave it to Ronda Rousey. And I say we because I think it was a vote by people. And Mayweather didn't win it, Rousey did. But what now remains to be seen is the impact that this has on Rousey. You know, where does she go from here? Does she go down a downward spiral? I mean, this loss was humbling. There were moments in this fight where Rousey looked completely lost, like she had no clue what she was doing. Does she go down a downward spiral and just becoming another failed name, somebody who had success way too fast? Or does she use this? Does she learn from this? Does she become better? Does she rematch Holm and give Holm the respect that she does? And with the new experience that Rousey has, become even better than she was before? We've seen that happen to certain fighters. I think Bradley's a good example of a fighter who took his first loss and went on a path that made him better. And then the other thing is, what's going to happen to women's combat sports now that they don't have the untouchable, undefeated star to lead the way? If women's combat sports has more success, was Ronda Rousey the sacrificial lamb that was needed to be created and then ultimately lose to create interest in women fighting? Or, you know, what could happen is that her loss is a fatal error, and that people start to turn on the sport. Who knows? I do hope, though, and I'm sure all boxing fans can agree with me on this one, that can we stop the claims that Rousey would beat up Floyd Mayweather? I mean, she couldn't even beat Holm, a female boxer, And she even had the opportunity to get on the floor with her, and she couldn't beat her. And this isn't meant to be critical of Rousey. It's just that mostly the fans perpetrated this narrative that she could beat Floyd Mayweather. I'm pretty sure now we all know that this is not true. All right, that's enough for vaguely related boxing, and let's go into real boxing now, actual boxing, and let's preview this week's fights. So this Friday, we have got a card that's going to be televised on True TV, which is somehow connected to HBO. It's going to be headlined by Gilberto Ramirez. He's going to fight Gregor Kachikian. He's out of the Netherlands. But right now, Ramirez, 32-0 with 24 knockouts, will face Kachikian. So here's what we know about Ramirez. And this will be a super middleweight fight. Right now, Ramirez is good at this point and for what he is. But when you watch him, there's something that's just unnatural about him. See, he's amassed this record of 32-0, and he really hasn't beaten anybody. Nobody of note. The one fight that he's had that's been worth something, he did win, but he looked really disappointing. He just looked like he was fighting with two left arms and he was right-handed. You can tell by this matchup that Top Rank is really hesitant to move Ramirez up too quickly. And you can't blame them. Ramirez might have star potential. He's a big southpaw. He's young. But for some reason, they're not willing to risk him just yet because they want to make sure that they're going to get their money's worth, and they might want to build him into a fight if they're going to cash out at some point. I don't think Ramirez is as good as advertised, by the way. And he's going to fight Kachikian, who's fought almost exclusively out of the Netherlands. The one time he didn't fight there was against James DeGale, and he lost. He was stopped in the 11th round. And, from what we know about James DeGale is one of the very best super middleweights out there. DeGale has power. He can box. Ramirez, on the other hand, has overrated power. And I expect Ramirez to actually get tested in this fight. I think Kachikian is better than advertised, and he's going to win. Or not he's going to win. What I mean to say is that Ramirez, if he's going to win, he's going to have to wear Kachikian down. There's no way he's going to go out there and just blitz through him. This is not going to be an easy fight for him. See, I don't like this matchup from a business perspective. I think if you're managing Ramirez, there are easier fights out there that you can get him that will do the same for him as far as his career. But as far as if you're his handler and you actually want Ramirez to get better someday, this is a great fight. This is a fight where we'll see what Ramirez is made out of. We'll see if he's actually any good because Kachikian will test him. And at the same time, he doesn't pose that much threat to him because he doesn't knock guys out. He's not really powerful. And he's also not a threat to completely outbox Ramirez. Although, when you think about it, in his last fight, not his last fight, but his last HBO televised fight, I did find that Ramirez could probably be easily outboxed by the right opponent. And by the right opponent, I mean a guy like George Groves, if he was up for it, could outbox Ramirez just based off of what we saw in that fight. I think Ramirez wins this one. I think it's a decision win, but I don't think it's just an easy fight for him. On the undercard, we're going to have Saul Rodriguez, 18-0 with a draw. He's going to be facing Ivan Nahara, who's 16-1. This is a lightweight division fight, and what a run Nahara's on. So he went from being this promising up-and-coming slugger to now a top-ranked gatekeeper in the span of months. See, the last time Nahara fought, he fought against Felix Verdejo, who is, everybody knows, he is one of the best prospects in the sport. A potential superstar, although it is a little troubling now knowing that Verdejo's really dealing with hand issues. And not I broke my hand, but this is actually going to become a problem if he has another hand injury. But Nahara, he's going to fight Rodriguez. And see, Rodriguez is also another up-and-coming fighter. He's undefeated, and this dude can punch. Now, I did notice in his last couple of fights that his opponents have been slightly better than the ones he had been facing before, and the knockouts just aren't there anymore. And that often happens with young prospects when they move up. They start to realize that, oh, yeah, when the opposition gets better, I do need to do things a little differently. And, guys who stop knocking guys out at the top level, or not the top level, but when they start to face better opposition, that's often because they're not doing anything differently than when they did before. If Rodriguez makes an adjustment, there might be knockouts that will come eventually. See, for us, sitting at home, not only do we get a good fight between two prospects, and even though Najera lost to Verdejo, he's still a good prospect. In that loss, Najera looked like a guy that you do want to see again. He just fights with that charisma. He might not be that good technically. He might not even be as strong as his, they want to advertise him as. But he fought with a charisma that was fun to watch. And Rodriguez is actually good, but certainly not unbeatable. I think Najera, he's not faced with the exception of Verdejo, he hasn't actually fought very good opposition. And I think Rodriguez is going to be the favorite here, but Najera could win this, and a good win for Najera gets him on HBO. This guy's entertaining to watch. On the other hand, though, if Rodriguez wins, now we have a big match, and I wonder if Top Rank does it, if they would sacrifice Rodriguez for Verdejo. I don't think they do it, but they might. So that'll be it for the True TV card that's going to be on that night. And also being televised that night is Diego De La Hoya over at the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Vegas. This will be on Estrella TV, which if you could find on your TV, let me know, because I'm to my knowledge, I don't know that Estrella TV actually exists. You might be able to watch this on Ring TV as well. But Diego De La Hoya is going to fight Giovanni Delgado in a super bantamweight fight. So don't think that just because Diego De La Hoya has the name De La Hoya, that he's just some overhyped duplicate of Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. That's not the case here. De La Hoya is actually good. He's surprisingly good. Now, will he win a world title at 122 someday? I don't know. I don't think so. It's too early to say for sure that he can or cannot win a world title. But at the same time, is he just this bum who's not going to be any good? No, I think you can say that Diego De La Hoya he's on a trajectory right now to compete at the world level. You see, De La Hoya does a lot of the little things that you want to see your prospect doing. He's patient. The footwork is good. He has power. He's a smart fighter. And Delgado now, coming into this fight, he's really tough. He just lost a decision. He just lost a decision to Jojo Diaz, who is one of the better prospects out there that Golden Boy has on the Canelo Kirkland undercard. So ultimately, this is going to be a good test for De La Hoya. He's still really young, both in age and in experience. And these are the kind of fights he needs. I think De La Hoya is at least 2 years away from entering the world level and possibly challenging for a world title. He does need to progress. He does need to keep winning if he's going to get there. So that's going to be the Friday action. We got a Top Rank and a Golden Boy card going head-to-head. Saturday, we have a much busier day of boxing, and the first fight we're going to get into, and it seems appropriate to go into this fight just based off of the events that happened in Paris this past weekend. Hassan N'Dam in Jacam is going to fight Avantdil Kurtz. I don't know how to say his last name, so I'm not even going to try. This is going to be a 12-rounder in the middleweight division. And N'Dam is coming off the second loss of his career to David Lemieux. And what you can count on N'Dam for is that he's basically a perennial title contender who will probably never win a world title. You see, N'Dam simply doesn't have that gear to go to that all the top level fighters have. You test Andre Ward and there's a certain gear that he operates in. But when you elevate your level, or you put him in there with a guy who's really good, say a Carl Froch, Andre Ward can go to another level that has him always prevail That's why he's undefeated. And Dom doesn't have that. See, he's got nothing as far as in his repertoire or in his skill set that is elite level, except for maybe recovering from knockdowns. But other than that, there's nothing that's elite about Ndam. But he is good, like really good at everything else, or not everything else, but everything. And if you aren't good, like you aren't excellent at something, you will lose. You see, Ndam nearly took advantage of Quillen's inability to finish and his stamina. And Ndam almost won that fight. Like, I think every round that Quillen didn't knock him down in, Ndam won. And I think Quillen knocked him down like a dozen times. So Ndam lost that fight. There was no way, but he won rounds there. He took advantage of the fact that Curtis Stevens is one-dimensional and beat him to get the title shot. David Lemieux uses his face for defense, and Ndam almost took advantage of that and won a decision. So Ndam really feeds off of guys who just aren't excellent, that aren't elite. Like, Ndam is always going to be there at the world level. He's always going to be a good opponent. The only thing is, the thing that holds him back is that he just doesn't have anything that puts him at that elite level. But as far as his stamina, his power, his speed, all of that stuff, Ndam is good, really good. He can compete with anybody in the middleweight division and be competitive. Now, does he beat them all? No. Now, this guy that he's fighting, BoxRec has him listed at 5'4" at the middleweight division. I don't know. Like, it wasn't last week, I think, where it might have been 2 weeks ago, where we had a super lightweight, 140 pounder that was 5'4", and now we got a middleweight at 5'4". I don't know what to make of that. I think maybe it's true. He does look kind of small from his picture, but 5'4" at middleweight. I thought Curtis Stevens was undersized at middleweight, but 5'4" is tiny. And Dom has already actually beaten him already. He beat him once back in 2010. It was a close fight, and I think that's why they're doing a rematch here, but ultimately Ndam beat him up. And I think Ndam's going to destroy him here. Okay, so let's go over to Germany now. And the card that's going to be aired on Sky as part of the Anthony Crolla Darleys Perez fight. It's going to be on Sky, and in Germany, it'll be on Sat 1. So this is a title fight between Arthur Abraham and Martin Murray. So this is going to be, just given that Andre Ward has officially announced that he's out of the super middleweight division, this fight is going to be for the SundayPuncher middleweight, super middleweight title, because by our metrics, Arthur Abraham is one of the top 20 in the sport. And now that the number one spot is vacant in the super middleweight division, it naturally makes sense that it's Arthur Abraham. Abraham has been at the top for a long time, and he's got the resume, and this is going to be the first defense of a SundayPuncher title. So Abraham, recently, he's beat up Paul Smith, and this is after Paul Smith had some success in their first meeting, and that was mostly because Arthur Abraham didn't take him seriously. I mean, who would have took Paul Smith seriously? He was a domestic fighter that was knocked out by other domestic fighters. So Arthur Abraham came in a little overconfident, maybe didn't train as hard as he normally does, and he still beat Paul Smith in their first encounter. The upset was that it was close, not that Smith had an argument for a victory there, because he didn't. And the second time out, Arthur Abraham, he proved basically everything I've just said by giving Smith the business and just really beating up on him. In most recently, Arthur Abraham, he took the fight to, well, actually he didn't. He knocked out Robert Stieglitz and ended his rivalry with him. And there's this one thing I wanted, and these three fights really highlight what Arthur Abraham is all about. You see, Arthur Abraham has two types of styles that he'll fight in. So the first is he's a come forward aggressive fighter. We saw this against Paul Smith, where Smith took the fight where Abraham took the fight to Smith. So that's one way he fights. And the other is that Abraham will shell up. He fights out of his guard. He absorbs a lot of punches, and he's able to block them. and then he counters with big punches. That's what we saw against Stieglitz, and Stieglitz paid the price because he fell into the trap. He sold out many times trying to get a knockout and to hurt Abraham, but nobody's ever really hurt Abraham. And he paid the price when Abraham just took advantage of Stieglitz gassing out, and he knocked him out. If for this fight on Saturday, we really need to see Abraham fight in the aggressive style. Otherwise, this fight will be unwatchable. It'll be dreadful to watch because we know what to expect out of Martin Murray. Martin Murray definitely fights out of his guard. He doesn't take too many risks. He counters when appropriate, and that's nice. That it's nice to see punches landed. But for the most part, Murray's a very safe fighter. We need to see Abraham come out and to test if Martin Murray's wounds from the Golovkin fight have been healed or not. See, Murray's come back and he's knocked out some guys at super middleweight and he's been successful, but come on. These guys that Martin Murray has faced since moving to super middleweight, you can't put much stock in them. The only thing you can say is that Murray still moves like he used to at super middleweight. I mean, that's all we can really take from these fights that he's been fighting. Now, if I'm Arthur Abraham, I want to come out quick and just put Murray to the test. See if he's a shot fighter. The betting lines, they favor Arthur Abraham. It's a slim favor. They don't think this is a complete mismatch. They think that Murray has a shot here, and I tend to agree. I think Murray's an accurate puncher. He defends well. He could pull off the upset here and win a decision over Abraham. I think it's very slim of a chance, and it's reflective in the line. Now, those people out there who are betting on Abraham, you're mostly betting on the fact that Arthur Abraham is going to be too active, he's too strong, and overall, he's a better boxer than Martin Murray. Those who are betting on the other way, which is to say that you're betting on Martin Murray, you're predicting that we're at the end of Arthur Abraham's reign. That Arthur Abraham is no longer a world-level fighter. That as an elite fighter, as a 35-year-old champion, that those days are all over. That Martin Murray's name is going to be added alongside Carl Froch and Andre Ward as the only guys to have legitimately beat Arthur Abraham. I know when you put it that way, it doesn't really seem like it's going to happen. This is going to be a tough one. I don't think Martin Murray's going to go in there and anything really is going to come easy for him because Arthur Abraham is tough. At one point in time, he was seen as a wrecking ball at middleweight. I think Abraham wins this fight. And they're fighting in Germany, and you know, we I don't want to say this explicitly, but we do know that sometimes Germany tends to get decisions wrong. On the undercard is going to be Tyrone Zeuge, 17-0 prospect against Edward Gutschnich. This is going to be a 12-round middleweight, super middleweight fight. Zeuge is 23. He's an interesting prospect. He's got power. He has some real fights under his belt. By that I mean real 12-round fights under his belt over legitimate guys. Gutschnich, he's never won at the world level. I don't think he's going to win this fight. I think he's tough, but tough doesn't win fights. I think Zeuge overall, he can be good, and I think he could actually compete at the world level someday. I don't think he's great right now, and I don't even think that he will ever be great. But I think right now, if you matched him against Gilberto Ramirez, I'm not quite sure who wins that fight. All right, let's go over to Manchester. As I read a text from Jason that says, I'm sorry, I passed out. Over in Manchester, on Sky Sports, we have the rematch between Darleys Perez and Anthony Crolla. So this is going to be a lightweight fight. And there is a sentiment out there that Crolla can't win this, that he has peaked, that in their first fight, Crolla missed his chance, that he'll never get better, that the window's closed, and he'll never be a world champion because he gave everything he had to give, and it wasn't enough. At least not enough to convince the judges, who were the only ones that mattered that day. But what did Perez do in the first fight that had everyone convinced that he could do that again. Because what I saw was a guy lose. I thought Crolla won that fight pretty clearly and convincingly. So what was it that had people think that Darleys Perez is easily going to beat Anthony Crolla in the rematch? The truth here is that Perez only looked just as good as Anthony Crolla. I mean, it's reflective in the score that it was a draw, that they were just as good and just as bad as the other. And I have no reason to believe that either guy has done anything to differentiate themselves from the other one since that fight. I don't think either is going to look at the tape and really find out how to make things go differently this second time around. I still think this is a dead even fight, that neither guy should be the favorite. It should be even money here. See, in this fight, though, Crolla has to stay active. He's got to look at that last fight critically. He can't just sit there and think, oh, I'm going to go out there and do the same thing and win this fight. Because guess what? It wasn't enough. The judges didn't like what you did last time. Same goes for Perez. You can't just come out and do the same thing. It will not work. What each guy needs to look at is where they settled, where they said, okay, that was good enough for that round. I don't need to do much more. Because those were the differences. Those were the swing rounds. Those were the times when they could have swayed things in their favor, and they just didn't. And I think if they look back, they could find those moments and really make the difference in the second fight. I think if I had to make a prediction here, I would go with Perez. And I'm only saying that I think we're going to walk away from this fight thinking that he won, but I think on the cards, Crolla's getting it. All right, so now we are at where most of you have listened up to this point for. We're at the pay-per-view. But we're typically we start with the main event and work down, but we're going to go opposite this way because I wanted to spend much more time on the Canelo versus Cotto fight. So let's start with what's likely to be the first fight on the card. And that is the Randy Caballero versus Lee Haskins fight. It's going to be a bantamweight division fight. Some bizarre stuff with the IBF is going on here. And you know that the IBF are typically and usually controversial. And they both hold the IBF title here. How does that make any sense? Oh, well, neither guy is the top at bantamweight. Maybe top 10 for both. So, but right now for this fight, Caballero, the younger guy, he's looked good, but Haskins has been on a tear lately against, whatever opposition, however you want to rate his opposition. I don't think it's very good, but he has pretty much knocked most of the guys out. And, but wait a second, Lee Haskins, you might remember him, the guy who got stopped by Stefan Jamoye back in 2012. Yeah, that's him. Caballero's young. He's hungry. He's undefeated. He has a little bit of power. I really don't think Haskins has much of a chance here. This is going to be a good fight, a really good way to open the pay-per-view. I think these guys are both going to bring it. But I do think that Randy he's actually ready to step onto the world level, whereas Haskins is still just barely holding on to his spot. All right, the next fight, which just got added, Guillermo Rigondeaux, 15-0, the current SundayPuncher Super Bantamweight champion, will face Giant Francisco. Now, here's what we could say about this fight. We could say that this is a terrible mismatch, that Francisco probably wouldn't beat a single fighter in the top 10 at 122, that Francisco took his first, that back in May of this year, Francisco lost a fight by first round stoppage. We could say that Guillermo Rigondeaux is clearly one of the most talented guys in all of boxing and one of the best fighters and just a master at boxing. And that he's going to destroy Francisco with ease. The only way that this fight goes longer than, I'd say, 6 rounds or so is if Rigondeaux chooses to play with his food, which is in the cards because we've seen Cuban fighters do that before, where they would rather punish their guy over 12 rounds and really assert their dominance as far as boxing over just going straight for the knockout. There's something with they would rather be dominant at the art of boxing versus some destructive puncher who just blows somebody out. But really what I want to do is I want to give Rigondeaux some credit, because it seems like he's finally, at long last, gained some sense and left whatever management he had before, whatever promotional agreements, and he signed with Rock Nation. Now, Rock Nation is not Top Rank or PBC or Golden Boy, because those are excellent promotional companies, and, technically PBC is not a promotional company, but what they do with the management of their fighters makes a lot of sense. And we really can't speak to that with the other promoters the way we can with the PBC brand, Top Rank, and Golden Boy. But it's a step in the right direction. Now, unfortunately, the one thing that we will say is that it still remains that the only way that Rigondeaux is getting himself on HBO is if it's a pay-per-view where the promoter gets their choice of who gets airtime. But don't worry, Rigondeaux fans. I know you guys are out there, and I always get destroyed whenever I criticize Rigondeaux. But look, there's some hope for Rigondeaux. Maybe when Nonito Donaire destroys Cesar Bazan for Rigondeaux's old title, the WBO who stripped Rigondeaux because he was out of action for 9 months. I mean, that's absurd to think about. That this guy fought last December 31st, and he's already been stripped for inactivity. Meanwhile, Andre Ward was able to keep the WBA belt for, 2 years or something, fighting seldomly. And it's not a criticism on these guys for being inactive. It's more criticism for the sanctioning companies who I just don't understand. But anyway, maybe they can do a big HBO rematch between Rigondeaux and Donaire, because there are some people out there that think that fight at their first fight wasn't that decisive. And they can even do it in Radio City. In fact, please do it in Radio City Music Hall. I would love if a quarter of HBO's fights were at Radio City Music Hall, because the camera angles in that fight were fantastic. Really enjoyed it. And it's an easy win for Rigondeaux. Unless he, takes Donaire on a few days' notice, which I'm pretty sure he's doing for Francisco. I find it hard to believe that Rigondeaux's known for 8 weeks that he was going to fight on this weekend and that he's been training his tail off. I doubt it. But given the gap in skill between the two guys, I don't think it really matters. All right, so now time for the co-main event, and that is going to be between Takashi Miura and Francisco Vargas. So Miura, 29-2 with 2 draws. Francisco Vargas, 22-0 with 1 draw. 22 of Miura's victories have come by knockout, and 16 of Vargas's 22 wins have come by knockout. So these guys have both got some power. This is a super featherweight fight. And for years now, Takashi Miura has been the clear number 2 guy at super featherweight. The only guy above him is Takashi Uchiyama, who has already beaten Miura. But Miura gave this guy everything that he could handle. I mean, there were points in that fight where it looked like Miura was going to be the one to win. Now, each of these guys can punch, and the question to ask for this fight is, what do you like? Because what you like will determine who you're going to side with. Do you like to know what to expect out of a fighter? Because if you're the kind of person that likes to know what they're getting before they make their pick, you're going to pick Miura. Because Miura has the experience at the top level. We pretty much know what we're going to get with a guy like Miura. He's going to put his face forward, or not his face forward. He's going to put his head down and walk forward behind punches. He's going to win on aggression and activity and use his power. And if you like the unknown, if you like to base your picks off of ceiling, what's potential, what's possible for a guy, then you're going to go with Francisco Vargas, who's pretty much unknown. I mean, not unknown, but he's pretty much a guy that hasn't had too much experience at the world level. He's already 30, although you would think he's a prospect just if you looked at his opponents. I mean, all of Vargas's wins to this date, all questionable. You could easily break them down. Jerry Belmontes, Abner Cotto, Juanma Lopez, Will Tomlinson. These are all fighters where it's like, okay, good for you. But everybody was going to beat those guys. None of those fighters stand out as like, wow, that's a really good win for you. I think based off of that win, Vargas should win this. But Vargas has been promoted into this position where he's fighting for a world title. And the truth is, we have no idea how good he is. There's no proof that you can point to for Vargas other than, well, he moves good, he's got length, he does have power. For me, there is this level of just almost like Vargas is a little unnatural at times, and he looks a little stiff when he fights. We do know that Miura is going to headhunt. That's for sure, and that he's going to stalk. And if Vargas can box on the move, he might be able to Chris Algieri this one. I just don't see, for one, Vargas having the power to truly hurt Miura. Or he'll have to knock him out because Miura is, I mean, he's an aggressive guy. He's going to need to make Miura walk into something big. I think this one, if I have to predict a victory, I think it's going to be for Vargas and by a decision. I do think he's a good boxer, and I think that's how he's going to beat Miura. But don't be surprised. I do think that that I'm only picking that by a very, very, very slim margin because I think there's a big part of me that thinks that Miura is going to stop Vargas. I mean, Miura's got the experience. He's been at the world level for a long time. He's faced some of the best fighters at super featherweight, and I think he can win this fight. All right, so with all of that said, that was all warm-up because I'm sure most people just wanted to know where we're going with Miguel Cotto and Canelo Alvarez. This is going to be a 12-round fight for the lineal middleweight title, although they're fighting at a 155 catch weight, so go figure. It's really just the 155-pound title, which both Cotto and Alvarez have just been the king of these past couple of years. So the question here is, how do you determine who the favorite is? What are you going to look at? Like, are you going to look at who's stronger? Who moves faster around the ring? Or who's the better puncher, the bigger puncher? Who has got the quicker hands? Who's got the better ring gear? It's probably a combination of all that. But let's look at the recent history. Let's use that with a fine-tooth comb and as pessimistic and as critical as a look. Let's look at both of these guys. Basically, what we're going to do here is paint a worst-case scenario picture of both fighters. And everything I'm about to say is not true. It's just a way to look at this situation. I don't think it's true at all, what I'm about to say. But doing this will give us a pretty raw and realistic look at both fighters. Just going to look at the ugly here. And first, let's start with Canelo. And again, I want to say that I'm going to be really critical here, and it's not necessarily how I feel. It's just a possible view to take that we're going to use to see who should be the favorite. And the question we're asking is, what has Canelo done recently in his last 5 fights? And I think 5 is fair. I think anything older than that just doesn't matter. So in his last 5 fights, Canelo has knocked out James Kirkland. He won a split decision over Erislandy Lara. He stopped Alfredo Angulo. Despite what CJ Ross says, he was basically shut out by Floyd Mayweather. And before that, he won a decision over Austin Trout. So, are we sure that Canelo is good? Are we sure? See, let's start with the Trout fight. If that fight is anywhere other than Texas, is that a unanimous decision win for Canelo, or is that a split decision win for one guy? Because I think Canelo won that fight, but like, remember, we're taking a pretty pessimistic and critical look. I can't say that he completely won that fight. You can't either. If you're going to argue that Canelo completely won that fight and that there's no doubt about it, you're crazy. Trout has a legitimate argument for that fight, and that should have been a split decision for one of the guys. And I don't care who it was, but if we're going to be pessimistic and really critical, Trout should have won that fight. I mean, he frustrated Canelo, He showed how ineffective Canelo was at cutting off the ring. Basically, Canelo looked fantastic with his head movement in that fight and his accuracy, but at the same time, we saw his limitations for the first time in full HD quality. Trout was there in the fight every step of the way. There were so many swing rounds, which as a boxer, that should be your main concern to minimize. Like, you should be trying to take away as many of the swing rounds as possible if you know you can't knock the guy out. And I think most guys know pretty early on if they're going to be able to knock the guy out pretty easily. So Canelo failed to minimize swing rounds. He failed to really comfortably win any rounds in that fight. And now, I mean, let's look at Trout. Is Trout good? Is that a good win? Because sometimes you can be competitive with the guy, and that's still good enough because that guy's an elite talent. So is Trout good? Where do we rate him? I think if we look back in hindsight, it does tell us that Trout is a good fighter, but he's certainly limited. I think it would be fair to say that Trout is basically a top-level intercontinental fighter. So not quite world level, not quite top tier, but he's right there. And he could contend and compete with the guys at that level, but he's most likely not going to win there. He might get a win here or there, but for the most part, he's right on the edge. I think Trout can win a world title, as he has, and but you're never going to say Trout is the best in the division. All right, so after Trout, it was Mayweather. Fair enough. It's Floyd Mayweather. Move on. Next was Angulo. It was a nice name to have on Canelo's resume, but Angulo was coming off a stoppage loss to Erislandy Lara. I mean, really, he retired himself in that fight, and he had moments where he looked good against Lara, but ultimately, he was outboxed in nearly every way imaginable, with the exception of the times when he knocked Lara down. Angulo hasn't had a solid win in over 4 years heading into that Canelo fight. So to place any sort of significance on that win, when Angulo looked like a punching bag for most of that fight, I mean, it's misleading. There's no way you should put any significance on that performance that Canelo had, which was fantastic against Angulo. Is hollow. Next is Erislandy Lara. I watched it live and thought it was a draw. But if we're critical, this can and maybe should be considered a loss for Canelo. Like, Canelo failed to do anything that he really wanted in that fight. He failed to cut off the ring for 36 minutes. I mean, there wasn't a moment in that fight where it's like, oh, he finally cut off the ring. I think at the end of the fight, I was still just frustrated with Canelo. I mean, and Lara too. I mean, both of those guys basically did everything you shouldn't do. But Canelo looked basic, and the only reason why I think he won is because they were scoring tenacity. Because with that, Canelo was terrific. He never stopped coming forward. He never stopped trying to win that fight. Whereas Lara was content to do Lara things and make people fall asleep. So between all of those wins so far, I think the best one that Canelo has gotten has to be James Kirkland. And it's only because Kirkland did actually look like his normal self. Angulo didn't look like the old Angulo, although you could argue that Angulo always looked old. But anyway, Kirkland did look like his normal self. He came out and did what Kirkland does. He threw bombs. He tried to stop Canelo very quickly and as early as possible. Canelo weathered that storm, and he went to work, and we know how it ended. He took his life, his boxing life, or whatever you want to call it. But now it begs the question: was Kirkland good? He had a crushing win over Glenn Tapia, not an upset because he was the favorite, but Tapia was supposed to be a good prospect. And Kirkland was on his way to losing against Carlos Molina before there was a disqualification and all the ridiculous stuff that happened. And now we have to look back to 2011 to find the last time that Kirkland had a really good win. So that's not really reliable. I mean, looking at the Angulo win, because that's the one I'm referring to let you know how good Kirkland was. So I think we can give Canelo 90% of the marks that we would give him for that Kirkland win. So if we're a pessimist, or maybe if Canelo had really bad luck, we would say at this point that he's got 3 losses on his record. 1 to Lara, 1 to Trout, and 1 to Mayweather. Now, what do all these guys have in common? We're going to get to that later. So now let's go to Cotto. And basically, remember, none of this is true. We're just basically looking to see how critical we can be and just to look at these guys with all the hype stripped away so that we can determine who's going to be the favorite. We'll start, since we started from earliest to now, we're going to start from now and go backwards with Cotto. Daniel Guile. So Daniel Guile had already quit once before, and that was in the Golovkin fight. And he'd been 2-2 in his last 4 fights when he met Cotto. And the only 2 wins that he'd had were against domestic Australian opposition. And I don't think we've seen an Australian domestic fighter come to America and, or really not even come to America, but just fight any world level opponent or even European level, intercontinental level opponents and be good. And Guile beat both of them, but really those wins aren't worth too much when you're talking about a world level fighter. The best win of Daniel Guile's career was most likely the split decision win he got over Felix Sturm. And, it was split, but that's mostly a unanimous decision win because you don't typically go into Germany and beat Felix Sturm without at least one judge disagreeing that you won. So, but how much is that win worth? I don't know. Like, what would Daniel Guile, what would be his equivalent? I mean, essentially, the fact that we have to ask that question, we just can't give full marks to Cotto for beating Daniel Guile, especially not when Guile had to weigh in 2 pounds under what would already have been draining for him, because you could tell that Daniel Guile, 160 was tough for him to make. And then you just watch the fight, and Guile was slow. Most likely, Daniel Guile just showed up to get paid anyway. So technically, Guile wasn't even that good to begin with. If we were to just be really fair here, Daniel Guile was just not that good. He had a high ranking, but that was it. Next was Sergio Martinez. And we figured Martinez was past his prime when he faced Martin Murray, given all the injuries that he dealt with in the wake of the Chavez Jr. fight. And we saw in the fight against Martin Murray, that wasn't the same Sergio we knew. I mean, some of the movement was there, but the guy had poor balance. He just looked sloppy. And then in the lead up to the Cotto fight, we found out he was doing very little sparring. He did no road work. I mean, no road work means he did not run. He was basically doing everything he could to ensure that there was no impact, no stress being placed on his knees. And then he shows up on fight night looking like he borrowed Shaquille O'Neal's shorts because he had 2 knee braces on that he was trying to hide. And, but for Martinez, at one point, he was actually great. But the Murray fight pretty much confirmed that there wasn't much left of that greatness. And Martinez just didn't have the style that lends itself to being old. It was reliant on a lot of physical traits and athleticism that you just don't have when you're older. So it's a good one, but again, it's a good name to have for Cotto, but it's just not that impressive when put into perspective. Now there's Delvin Rodriguez, a career Friday Night Fights fighter with no defense, who had lost to Austin Trout and Ashley Theophane prior to that. I mean, it's enough said. Great win for Cotto. Looked great, but not much can be learned from the Delvin Rodriguez fight. And then there was Austin Trout. Now, Cotto lost this fight because he came in with a horrible game plan. I don't know that he loses to Trout every single time he fights him, but with that game plan, he's never winning. See, Cotto came in to try to bully Trout. Trout was clearly a bigger fighter. He was quicker than him. Cotto couldn't hurt him. So Cotto couldn't do anything in that fight, and he took the loss. And Trout, what we said, and from what we said earlier, Trout's a good fighter at his level, not quite world level. He can compete on that level, but he's not going to get a lot of wins at the world level. And then there's Floyd Mayweather. Again, enough said. We're not going to pick apart anybody for losing to Floyd Mayweather because Floyd Mayweather was the best of his generation. So now, who do you like? Do you like Cotto, the guy who's been impressive lately on the back of some wins over diminished opposition? Or do you like Canelo, the guy who beats up on guys who are out of his class and at the very least will hang in there with guys that are actually really good? With the exception of Mayweather, unless you ask CJ Ross, who will say that Canelo definitely hung in there. All right, so the money line from the betting perspective, how money lines work, by the way, is you'll get a plus and a minus number. So whoever's minus is the favorite, and what that's saying is you have to bet that amount, the minus amount, in order to win $100. And on the other side, if it's plus something, basically if you bet $100, you're going to win the plus amount. So in this fight, Alvarez is minus 300. They think that you would have to bet $300 in order to win 100 if Alvarez wins. Now, putting that in perspective, Mayweather was a minus 220 favorite against Pacquiao, which means that to the people setting the lines, Alvarez is a bigger favorite than Mayweather. They thought that the Mayweather-Pacquiao fight was closer than Canelo and Cotto. When it comes to the Pacquiao versus Rios fight, they thought that Cotto has a better shot at beating Alvarez than Rios did of Pacquiao, and Pacquiao was a minus 400 favorite in that fight. A line that's really close is the Amir Khan-Devin Alexander fight. So they thought that Amir Khan was minus 280. He was less likely to beat Devin Alexander than Canelo is at beating Cotto. It's close, but basically, according to them, Alexander had a better shot at beating Khan than Cotto does at beating Alvarez. So that's kind of what the odds say. And they're likely looking at Canelo's power, his speed, his youth, his ability to land concussive body punches over the duration of a fight to wear Cotto down. I see what they're getting at with why they would favor Canelo based off of those factors, but you got to take into consideration that Cotto is he's a much better boxer than people give him credit for. He moves. He's great at moving. He's fluid. If there's a criticism style-wise, I think Cotto backs up in a straight line at times when he shouldn't. And the one thing that I've watched a lot of Cotto, and the thing that is critical to his success here is to get Canelo to bite on that right hook to the body. He's knocked out so many guys in his career with that combination of the right hook to the body. So he's an orthodox fighter, so that's the rear hand, right hook to the body, and that's the setup punch because it draws the hands down for the left hook over the top. Canelo's got to avoid that punch, and now we're getting into the specifics of this fight. But at the same time, for Canelo, he's got to cut off the ring. If he can cut off the ring against Cotto, he's going to take away, a lot of what Cotto's planning to do, which is likely going to be to frustrate Canelo by moving. And if he can do that, then he can work the body. Then he can land those shots that he lands that really wear down opponents. And I think if he does that, Canelo can win this fight. The one thing I worry about is if Canelo realizes early on that his game plan is not working, will he adjust? Because Canelo's stupidly stuck to game plans. The Mayweather fight is a prime example of Canelo not adjusting anything despite seeing that it was just futile to keep trying what he was doing. At the same time, one of the Freddie Roach criticisms that you could make is that Roach doesn't make his fighters adjust. He really rarely tells them to do anything other than throw more combinations or go knock the guy out, which is obvious. I don't think most fighters need to be told to go knock a guy out. I think most of the time they can put that together by themselves. So it really is a question of what do you like here, the youth or the experience? Canelo's, and if you look at some of the things though, I say youth versus experience. Cotto has more experience at the world level just by nature of him being in the game a bit longer than Canelo. I mean, Cotto's been competing at the world level for almost a decade now. But if you actually look at total opponents faced, Canelo has faced more opponents. He's actually fought more professional fights while being 10 years younger. Canelo has fought more rounds total in his career. It's close, 314 to 309, but Canelo has boxed more rounds than Cotto has. Cotto has not even faced a better opposition because Canelo's faced guys with almost a similar, not similar, but almost the same win percentage. So this is a pretty even fight. And based off of what you see, though, as far as who you like and what style you prefer, that's probably going to tell you who's going to win this fight. All in all, though, this should be a terrific fight. I don't think it's going to be as entertaining as a lot of people do. Cotto's very patient. Cotto moves, and Canelo doesn't throw a lot of punches. Canelo's content to be a counterpuncher, and if both guys try to do that, we're not going to have a ton of action that you would expect in a war, just given what these guys have done before, because both guys have gotten themselves into wars. But if you look at that, you'll see that those wars were typically the pace was set by other guys. All in all, this is going to be a terrific tactical battle, and it's going to be another entry into the long and fabled history of Mexico versus Puerto Rico. I don't know who wins. I tend to agree usually with the money lines and who the odds-on favorites are in that who's most likely to win here. Well, Canelo's most likely to win based off of what we've seen. But as far as what my opinion is, I'm undecided. I think Alvarez is rightly the favorite. But is Cotto really going to be outboxed? Is Cotto really going to be stopped? We've seen it, but I'm not so sure that Canelo is as good as what his record would indicate. We are lucky, though, that we're getting this fight. This is a big fight, and we've gotten two really highly anticipated fights this year in Mayweather-Pacquiao and now Canelo-Cotto, which is a fight that's been kicked around for a while. So that's going to be it for the preview episode. Thank you for listening. I do want to point out that if you haven't looked through the Miguel Cotto versus Saul Alvarez viewing guide, I would encourage that. I put a lot of work into that, and more questions get answered in that one, and there's a lot of cool statistics that I came up with, and there's also an entire podcast that I did with Jason that's just about this fight. Americans, you can order this live on HBO pay-per-view, call your cable or satellite or whatever the hell. For people who don't have cable, I'm sorry, but you can't order this online. I know it's 2015, and for some reason, the concept of streaming online is still eluding HBO, and I'm not quite sure why you can't stream it online, but for some reason you can't. And it's a shame because I think a ton of people, they'd get a lot more buys if they were willing to offer this for purchase online. All right, thanks for listening. We'll be back next week.
Vamos a dance, a pachanguear. Luego los vatos en mi clantón voy a encontrar.